Due Process, winner of 25 Regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
Harvard's history was inseparable from the history of slavery and the slave trade.
So is the early history of Princeton, where the first 8 of its presidents themselves owned slaves. And those demands to purge the name of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton for his unapologetic racist actions and views were just the start of the exposure of Princeton's sordid past. What became of those demands?
We're here! We've been here!
And the undeniable links between nearly all the American Academy and slavery, with Craig Wilder, who airs the Academy's dirty secret in his prize-winning book. Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation and the PSEG Foundation, making things better in our communities.
Those protests by black students at Princeton, they may have forced some minor concessions, but apart from removal of a cafeteria mural, they left Woodrow Wilson firmly in place. But the bigger story is the history of slavery, the centuries of university-linked abuse and exclusion, and not just at Princeton. I'm Sandra King, and that's what I'll be talking about with Craig Stephen Wilder, whose book, Ebony and Ivy, helped expose those ugly truths. But first, a reminder of what was roiling at Princeton before the leaders there opted for status quo.
We're here! We've been here! We ain't leaving!
And they didn't leave Nassau Hall for 32 hours, until the president agreed to at least consider their demands, even the purging of Woodrow Wilson.
Why Wilson? Well, because Wilson is definitely one of the most idolized figures on this campus. When you enter as a freshman, there's a play. A segment of that play honors Wilson, says, oh, what would Wilson do?
But it's some of what Wilson did as president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and president of the United States that's prompted protest from some black students and supporters on this prestige campus, where Wilson is an icon.
To have Woodrow Wilson's name plastered across buildings, to idolize him, to see him as a god on this campus, that is disgusting.
His name and image here are ubiquitous, especially at the world-renowned Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.
I champion the students who took over Nassau Hall and who've raised this issue of Woodrow Wilson. And I think that we should remove all symbols and all names that uphold white supremacy and racism.
Consider these Wilson words.
The domestic slaves, at any rate, and almost all who were under the master's eye, were happy and well cared for.
Or his admiration for
a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country.
There is no shortage of shocking examples from this national symbol of progressive democracy.
Segregation is not a humiliation, but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen.
Woodrow Wilson shows us that someone who supports democracy in so many arenas of his life can also be a racist.
President Ivy said Woodrow Wilson had flawed characteristics. Those are not just flawed characteristics.
Not when they had direct destructive impact on real people's lives. Whether it was the prospective black students rejected by Princeton until the 1940s.
No Negro has ever applied for admission, and it seems unlikely that the question will ever assume practical form.
Or the black federal employees whose careers and livelihoods felt Wilson's racist policies firsthand.
In places where whites and blacks would work, they would raise like a screen or partition to separate the white and the black in the federal government of the United States.
In an op-ed in the New York Times, lawyer Gordon Davis, once New York City's Parks Commissioner, recounted the story of his own grandfather, a manager in the government printing office pre-Wilson.
He had spent his career in a time and place where, whatever was happening in the South, African Americans were able to get ahead. And then, suddenly, with Wilson's election, that all changed.
Along with the rest of the black federal workforce, John Abraham Davis was demoted, his salary cut in half.
He reversed decades of racial progress. In doing so, he ruined the lives of countless talented African Americans and their families.
Mike Brown! Say it again! Mike Brown!
Inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement,
Who built this place? We built this place! Who built this place? We built this place!
the Princeton protests reached beyond Wilson, targeting curriculum, campus culture, and the racism these students say is not entirely different than what Newark activist Larry Ham found here more than 40 years ago.
When I first got to Princeton, I remember one of the first days, I'm talking about in 71 now, you know, somebody in the cowardly way, they wouldn't stop and do it to my face, but they rolled by and hollered out nigger. You know, it existed when we were there in the 70s, and it exists today.
You don't understand that because you're white. Like, I'll just explicitly say that.
The students in the Black Justice League have issues on their mind. They have questions in mind that other people have not in the past brought with such ferocity to our thinking about Woodrow Wilson. Wilson existed, these events took place, and I think our job at a university is to keep tangling with them, keep wrestling with them.
And that includes pushback from another, mostly white student group, claiming acquiescence to Black Justice League demands would threaten academic independence and free speech at Princeton.
It's not for his flaws, but for his positive contributions that we are honoring him. And we are glad that there is more discussion about Woodrow Wilson's legacy. But the Black Justice League's demand to erase his name will give the impression of a university-sanctioned orthodoxy or taboo.
And so, on a campus whose last major protests were the sit-ins Larry Ham organized 40 years ago against investment in apartheid South Africa, there is new activist expression and energy.
My hope is that the other demands that they raised for changes in curriculum and more professors of color and so on and so forth, the more structural kinds of demands, that hope they don't get lost in this big discussion about Woodrow Wilson.
We here? We here. We've been here. We've been here. We ain't leaving. We ain't leaving. We are loved. We are loved.
Now, they've mostly lost that fight, but their issues, like their protests, aren't confined to Princeton. And no one knows that better than Craig Stephen Wilder, who meticulously documents the racist underside of the Academy in his Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of American Universities. Craig Wilder, welcome to Due Process.
Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you, before we start talking about your book, your reaction to the Princeton protests, to the Woodrow Wilson question, and to what the university did in response.
You know, I think to the protest, I'm excited about seeing a generation of students who are active on campus, who are becoming increasingly politicized around a range of issues, actually, from the history of slavery on their campuses to the environmental challenges that face the nation. We're actually looking at a real exciting age of student activism. For the university, I'm saddened and disappointed at the narrowness and the lack of courage in the decision. But I also think that this struggle actually exposes a fault line in American universities, and particularly at elite universities, where we often prefer to see black students and students of color, and white women for that matter, as beneficiaries of our benevolence. But we become, in fact, very conservative and really quite mean when those very same students, students of color, white women, begin making demands upon the institution and begin demanding the kind of institution that they want to attend rather than the one that's being handed to them.
Were you surprised? Did you think that Woodrow Wilson would go?
I didn't think Woodrow Wilson would go because there are multiple reasons for having, particularly someone who's a former president of the United States. You get into a difficult political history, a very politicized history. I did think that the university would do more in actually really addressing the concerns of the students, the broad set of concerns that the students had, and looking for other ways to actually respond to the needs that the students actually expressed inside those demands.
So if you were the person in charge of that committee, what would your response have been? You'd have said, take the name off of the Woodrow Wilson School?
Well, if I were in charge, a lot of names would change.
And that's my next question.
Which is,
how do you then, this is what the apologists for something like what Princeton did say, where do you stop?
Well, look, I think this is the problem that we have. The names on buildings at universities are not sacred. There's nothing sacred in a name on a university building. We change names all the time. Every time we do a major renovation project, or we're building a new structure, but let's just take a major renovation project. The first thing we sell is the naming rights to the building. We'll take the name of the founder of our university off of a building if someone will write a big enough check. And so the idea that the name is itself somehow sacred is simply untrue. And what I'd like to see us do is really to have a more honest conversation about what these names mean, and also what they do to the environment that students actually attend university in.
One of the things that the students were saying in their protest was they don't feel safe with the name, the bust, the pictures of Woodrow Wilson around. And that received such negative reaction from the whites on campus that, and even from professors who wouldn't come out with their names, but were channeling to various outlets how they felt that they were somehow injured by this position. This is a very separated world, even though some people would like to think that we're post-racial.
Well, I think our university leaders are learning an important lesson, that the racial environment of the campus is much more toxic than they like to admit. And there's a lot of work to be done around questions of race. The good news for all of us is actually that there's a generation of students who refuse to accept the status quo on the university campuses. The difference between when I went to college and students today is that when I went to college, actually, I had no expectation at my historically white university that I was going to be treated well. I was just ready to be treated badly for the entire 4-year experience. And my goal was, my goal was to, graduate and just get the heck away from there and never go back again. That's a sad statement. I'm delighted to see a generation of students who refuse to accept that. And there's lots that can be done around the name Woodrow Wilson. The first thing that we could do is actually be honest about Woodrow Wilson. That if we're going to use his name, then let's also actually be honest about the history that that name brings, with all of its ugly baggage.
Well, the president said, yes, we concede he's a racist, but.
Well, conceding it is different than actually, publicizing it, making it part of the way that you introduce the structures that are named after him. And so if you want to keep the name, then keep the burdens that come with the name. But don't ask students to be silent. Don't demand that they actually erase themselves and erase the emotional experiences that they have on our campuses in order to make the people in charge, to make their jobs easier.
I learned from Marnie Sandweiss that the first 8 presidents of Princeton owned slaves. That doesn't surprise you. You've got a whole book that documents exactly that kind of story.
And we have a rogues gallery of their pictures. Yeah.
So what about Princeton? Was it any worse? I mean, we know it as the place where the Southern gentry sent their children. But you say, hey, it wasn't just Princeton, and it wasn't just William and Mary.
It was everyone.
It was everyone. So,
and what I try to do in the book is avoid better and worse, and precisely because of the reason that you're pointing to, it gets really slippery and complicated when you do better and worse. Better and worse doesn't help you understand the 18th century college all that much. What you have is actually, for instance, with Princeton, a 25-year period, basically beginning about 1745 and ending in 1769, a quarter of a century, when the number of colleges in the American colonies, in the English colonies, more than triples from 3 to 10. And those new schools include, Codrington College down in Barbados, which we never think about, but then Princeton and the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth, are all in that group. Right.
all slave connected?
All slave connected, all established in that same 25-year period, and that's exactly the moment when the African slave trade is peaking. And the funds for this kind of institutional investment are beginning to get gathered in the various colonies, when the denominations, the religious denominations that are establishing these new schools can
And it was across the board.
Right, can turn to the merchants, the slave traders in their communities, and actually begin to leverage that wealth to establish and to lay claim to their colonies by establishing new institutions like colleges and universities.
You mentioned Rutgers, where we are sitting and talking right now. What was the complicity here?
It's, in the 1760s, when the college is being established, when Queens College is being established, there's a Dutch slaveholding belt that reaches from Long Island all the way out west to the region we're sitting in right now, to New Brunswick, and actually even past New Brunswick. And you're talking about, in fact, really sort of dense slaveholding patterns in places that include, Flatbush in what's now Brooklyn, New York, but also New Brunswick. And so you have, in fact, this dense slaveholding belt in which the college is being established. And you also, in fact, have Dutch New Jerseyites and Dutch New Yorkers who are investing in the African slave trade, the Schuyler's and others who are actually pumping money into the slave trade. And Rutgers, like a lot of the new colleges.
And the Livingstons.
And
We're right now on Livingston campus.
That's right, and the Livingstons. And, and Rutgers, like a lot of colleges, is going to face the problem of how it's going to survive in an extraordinarily competitive colonial education market. And the answer is by really turning to the slave-holding and slave-trading families and working heavily to recruit their children as students and to recruit the parents as donors. And so the American college is going to be a college not just established by slave owners and slave traders, but it's going to be a college in the service of slave owners and slave traders that's going to survive by actually attaching itself to that economy and making itself useful to the masters of that economy.
You talk about a third pillar. What does that mean?
I was trying to think of a way of really understanding the place that the college plays. And I decided that to really understand it, you have to situate the college next to the state, the government, and the church as the third pillar of American slavery, meaning that American slavery requires, and especially by the 18th century, an intellectual defense. It requires an argument that erases the moral problem of enslaving other human beings.
What you call scientific racism.
Right, with scientific racism, with all of the
Claiming
violence.
that science supports the idea that Europeans are just by birth superior.
Right. And what you have is, in fact, by the 18th century, American colleges really turning themselves to the project of proving race, which is a project that actually drives higher education in the 19th century, but it's already present in the 18th century world. And so you have, in fact, actually college faculty helping to develop the new science of race. In the book, I argue that race is not an idea that comes from science or comes from universities. Universities play a different role in our sort of racial history. Race emerges actually in the violent, horrific, brutal world of Atlantic slavery. These ideas emerge. They evolve in the social world. What
But
the
they
academy
are embraced,
does,
you say, by the academy.
they're embraced, but the academy does the difficult work of refining them and giving them intellectual legitimacy by laying a veneer of science on top of them, by giving them scientific language and making, in fact, extraordinary scientific claims about the the racial history of people in the world and the centrality of race for understanding both social and political problems.
And back to Woodrow Wilson, who of course was president of Princeton before he was president of the United States. He was very outspoken on believing that in fact there were almost two species.
Right.
And one was superior and white, and the other was just intellectually and morally inferior. That was in the 20th century. How do you get away from that kind of thing? And I'm wondering, well, let's not get yet to the implications for now, but let me ask you something else, and that is, I know you weren't surprised that you got pushback from some academics who said that your scholarship wasn't as good as it could have been. One particularly vicious by Jonathan Yardley in the Washington Post, who says, this guy just, throws out a lot of unsupported claims, like that there was a great deal of influence by the universities. But you say there was.
Absolutely. And look, this is the problem that you have.
Oh my goodness, we have 4 minutes left.
Harvard in the 18th century is not Harvard in the 21st century. And so one can make the argument that Harvard isn't as influential in the 18th century as it is in the 21st century. Well, to be perfectly honest, Massachusetts isn't as influential in the 18th century. The Anglican Church in New York isn't as influential. None of our institutions are as influential. They all evolve with it and become more powerful. But in fact, one of the ways that the American university actually achieves its prestige and its power is precisely by servicing the slave economies. And so to argue that they don't have that kind of influence is to miss the actual point. That's how they earn that influence. That's how they become powerful.
With just 3 minutes left, we can't do this conversation without talking about Georgetown.
Sure.
Different in that we know that Jesuits, priests, had slave holdings, mass slave holdings, sold off hundreds of slaves, including babies and children, separated families, in part because they no longer wanted to be involved in slavery. So why not just sell people? I mean, that cleans it up, right? And in part because they had debts. So now Georgetown is able actually to trace, because there are good records, these people, their ancestors, their progeny, and you've got maybe thousands of people who come from those families who were sold, separated, brutalized, sold south. Right. Whatever was going on where they were with the Jesuits, we know it had to get worse. So what do you think, if you were asked to be a consultant and advise the president of Georgetown now, who went and had a nice lunch with one of the descendants, what would you say to do?
I was actually just at Georgetown a couple of months ago to give a talk on this very topic, Georgetown and slavery and the sale of 1838, and the long history of Jesuit slaveholding. And I think there are a few things that Georgetown needs to do. First, Georgetown actually has to embrace that past by fully understanding the role that slavery played, not just in the establishment of Georgetown, but in rescuing the Catholic Church in the colonial period. The anti-Catholicism of the English colonies was fought off. Catholics actually survived in the Protestant colonies, in the English colonies, by relying upon the slave economy to protect themselves, to fund themselves. Catholic institutions get funded by slavery and by these plantations, the plantations in Maryland. And so it's not just Georgetown, it's the first Catholic seminary, the first Catholic bishop, John Carroll, is a slave owner. As someone born and raised Catholic who went to Catholic schools and a Catholic university.
Were you shocked when you found this?
No, because I actually knew some of the history of Catholics and slavery in the broader Americas from the time I was in high school and college. But I think Georgetown has to embrace this story, and then it really has to think about how do you make reparations for that past? And the answer is they have to turn to something that defines them, which is the Catholic and the Jesuit commitment to social justice.
And Craig Wilder, I can't believe that a half hour has gone, but we're going to have you back because there's so much
I'd
more
love to come back.
so much more to talk about. It has been a privilege to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to you for watching. We're here every week with the tough questions of law and justice, and we're online at any time. Our entire archive on demand at dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu. For producer Tanya Bentley, for Raymond, who had this one off, and for all of us here at Due Process, I'm Sandra King. See you next time.
Many of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders themselves. And our own campus here at Princeton has such a deep history of liberty and slavery, liberty and racism being intertwined. In the summer of 1766, the president of this university, a man named Samuel Finley, planted 2 sycamore trees in front of his house, which still stands on our campus, to celebrate the overturning of the Stamp Act. He was a patriot. 2 months later, he died, and his human beings, his slaves, were sold in that house on our campus. So those trees that speak to the triumph of the American Revolution and to American freedom guarded a house where slaves were sold. That's the paradox, and it exists right here at Princeton.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and watch us on demand on YouTube.